Over these last 12 weeks, hard to believe it's been that long, we've been exploring named and unnamed women in the Bible. Some of them have been familiar to us. We know their names, or at least their stories. Others have been harder to identify. Each of them has invited us to consider who we are in relation to others, to their stories, to God, to our larger story of faith. On this final Sunday in this series, and as we prepare to turn a corner to look at our next series on call, we look at one more group of women, named and unnamed. As you've heard, they are told as part of Paul's travels. He came to Philippi, encountered a group of women who gathered at the river. And there are some commentators who suggest that at least the first part of this passage originally took place somewhere else and was later inserted into this story, because the passage that you heard leads into a much more familiar story, at least a much more familiar conversion story, that of Paul's jailer who, after an earthquake that rattles the prison, opening the gates, and the jailer is prepared to take his own life, only to discover that Paul is still there, and instead he and his household are baptized. Some question what reason there could possibly be to have two conversion stories in the same city. And if it's a matter of choosing the more dramatic story, Lydia and these women who become a community of faith pale in comparison. Paul had found his way to this place he had heard as a place of prayer. And there he encountered these God worshipers. And it's hard to tell from the context whether this is a group of men and women or women only, but the scripture says that he addressed the group of women. Lydia is the only one of this group who is named, and she becomes a believer who, with her household, become baptized. In a time when women often stood in the shadows, she is a businesswoman, a dealer in purple cloth. She is an authority and a leader, but there is nothing miraculous that happens here. So those who suggest that this interaction happens somewhere else, that there isn't room for two conversion stories, who feel a need to prize the dramatic over the subtle, they may have missed a tendency of the author of Luke and Acts to pair stories, companion stories, two sides of the same understanding. Without the dramatic addition of prison doors flinging open, Lydia's story might actually be the one that's more accessible to us. A reminder that the gospel is compelling enough without needing to have a miraculous intervention. Instead, Lydia is drawn into a community with her heart opened. She was part of this gathering at the river, but she was drawn into a larger community of faith. People who were similar to her, people who were different from her. And her household, as they were baptized, were drawn into a promise that each person had sacred worth because of God. She was on her way to understanding God from an outsider's, Gentile's perspective to an insider's awareness. She not only embraced the message that Paul brought, but was in turn embraced by his welcome. And in response, she asked for Paul to come and stay with her, to accept her offer of hospitality, and he agreed. Now, it's hard to tell from the context of this story if Paul had time to settle into these guest quarters, or if it was immediately interrupted by a one day. One day, Paul was on his way to this place that he had found of prayer and was met by a young woman who had a Pythian spirit, one who had a connection to the oracle at Delphi. And that spirit made her valuable to those who owned her, those who called her their own, not out of love, but out of profit, because she was able to prophesy and make them a lot of money. NRSV calls her a slave girl. Common English Bible calls her a slave woman. The Greek paidiskane is clear that this is a slave or a servant, but doesn't differentiate on what age. It's almost irrelevant to the term. She was likely a foreigner. And from this context, she only has value to those who enslave her because of what she can provide for them. The text said she made a lot of money. And at first, Paul's encounter with this girl or woman who is enslaved seems to resemble the story of Jesus going to the home of Jairus to heal his daughter, only to be interrupted by a woman who has been hemorrhaging. Jesus healed both the woman and the girl, and while their stories become linked by his touch, they may never have met each other, but they both had a connection to Jesus. This encounter doesn't unfold in that way. Instead, this unnamed paidiskane followed Paul and company around for some time, calling them servants of the Most High God, who proclaimed to them a way of salvation, or in some versions, the way of salvation. The words themselves wouldn't be so different from what Paul would announce. But either the tone or the source of this information get under Paul's skin. Day after day, she followed him and company until Paul had it with her and shouted for the spirit to leave. This impromptu exorcism may have had nothing to do with compassion, and it is instead motivated by annoyance that the spirit and the woman herself were getting in his way. It was effective, but the focus moves almost immediately from her to Paul and those who identified themselves as her owners. And unlike stories of exorcisms performed by Jesus where people are described as healed, she appears to be discarded. To them, this woman, this girl, no longer had any value to them. In anger, they sought to have Paul and Silas punished, and the woman disappears from the story. I wonder what she felt as she saw all this happening. Was she happy to be freed from the Spirit? Was she truly free? Did she miss the sense of power or value she had had with the Spirit that had previously guided her? The Bible is sometimes, often, maddeningly silent about what happens after the events that are included. For that matter, Lydia all but disappears from the story too. The community she began to create with Paul's presence is left in uncertain terms. She was, after all, on her way to being included in this broader gathering of people, and her story was interrupted. After Paul and Silas were jailed and then released, they did return to Lydia's home. And in one verse, we are told that Paul briefly encouraged the men and women there and then went on to the next place in their journey. If a congregation flourished under Lydia's leadership, that information is lost to us. A woman who gathered a group of women in prayer is part of the story of faith that has been expanding ever since biblical times. And what happened next in their story is only available to us in our imaginations. And so I wonder if Lydia and her community might have met the woman who had previously been a source of income and a nuisance to Paul. Could she be part of the balance that the author of Luke Acts had in mind? A young woman without means in contrast to a believer who owned a business and likely had servants of her own. Would Lydia have been annoyed with the enslaved woman who interrupted her journey of faith? Or might she have shown compassion to someone who was on the margins, just as she had been at the riverbank on the outskirts of the city? In my imagining, I want to see Lydia as one who recognized that this woman's voice had been taken away from her and that she too longed for someone to accept her just for herself, to be told that God had given her gifts and that loved her. Maybe she even took this woman into her gathered community. Would her heart have been opened as well? Long accustomed to hearing the voice of the Spirit to guide her, what would it have meant to be told that the Holy Spirit was with her, to be embraced by those who didn't want to exploit her for personal gain? That's the end of the story I would love to hear. And I know that life doesn't always unfold that way. In our seeking of meaning, on our way to finding what gives joy and satisfaction, in our longing to belong, we sometimes miss those whose paths intersect ours, and we may see those who are part of the larger community as more of a bother than a sister or brother. When I was in 6th grade, my family moved twice. First, to a campground where we lived in a trailer while my dad was training to be an electrician. And then to Wellsboro, at the top of Pennsylvania, where land was cheap and my parents hoped to make a fresh start. For any of you who are familiar with that part of the state, it is beautiful, a great place to visit, and very difficult to break in if you're an outsider. I was already somewhat suspect as a foreigner in that place, but I had challenges. It is never, rarely easy for someone in middle school to feel like they fit in. But I was awkward beyond the ordinary challenges of adolescence. I wore corrective shoes and glasses. I felt uncomfortable in my body. I just wanted to fit in. But I often felt like I was on the fringes of social groups. Church was one of my few places of safety, of security, of welcome. But it seemed to me that there were few people who were less a part of inner circles. That is, except for Eve. In that very white, very rural town, there were only a handful of people of color. Eve and her twin brother Adam, not making up these names, were exceptions. Beyond skin color and names that made those who were aware of anything of biblical stories snicker, Eve had significant learning challenges. And on top of that, she suffered from epilepsy. I had a few elective classes with Eve, and I rode on the same bus as she did. I witnessed several times when she had grand mal seizures. It seemed no one wanted to be around her. Not Adam, her own brother, and despite growing up in the church, not I. I don't recall that I ever participated in the name calling that she received, but I also can't remember ever standing up for her. I knew of her presence, but we might as well have been strangers in a big city instead of neighbors in a small town. Instead, I focused on my own longing to feel included, wondering if those I wanted to befriend would come to my house as a guest, if I invited them. Back then, I never gave much thought to how often Eve must have felt neglected, rejected in a place that had little welcome or tolerance for those who might be different, however that was defined. My family moved again a few years later. I don't know what happened to Eve, how her life turned out, but I think of her from time to time and wonder about her view of the world. My life intersected with hers for such a short period. I have no way to reach out to her, and even if I could, what would I say to atone for the ways that I neglected to see her as important to my life? I identified more with Lydia. I've grown up in a community, and while I've sometimes been on the margins, I've known God's love. I have had a sense of belonging in the church wherever I have been. I long for the biblical stories in Acts to continue on in ways that are better than how I have lived, and the times when I have failed to fully live out my faith. Even so, I wish that I had a way to tell Eve that her life impacted me in ways I couldn't have known at the time. Peace activist Ched Myers, addressing a gathering of Christian peacemaker teams, now community peacemaker teams, talked about getting in the way of Christ. Not getting in the way of being opposed to Christ, but getting in the way, in the path of Christ that then confronts systems of injustice. I wish I had known that then, and am challenged to live that now. In hearing Lydia's story, in the gathering of women around her, this snippet of life of an unnamed woman with a spirit, as well as all the other stories and lives that we've encountered in this series, I am challenged, and I hope you are too, to learn from them. In positions of power and those who struggle to find a voice, in acts of boldness and awareness of lives made whole with healing, with those who challenge authority and who nurture life, those who have helped us on the way to deepen our faith. Each life, each story has offered ways to reflect, to model our lives, and to make similar and sometimes different choices. We, in turn, pass along these stories of faith, named and unnamed, and add to them our own, giving others the opportunity to explore, to embrace, and to question as they examine what it means to live and be led by God's leading and love. May we hold them all, remembering them, celebrating them with honor and with grace. May it be so.